Intern uncovers million-dollar accounting error. CFO's reaction in board meeting leaves everyone stunned. Hello. Welcome. Leave a like, subscribe, activate notifications, and enjoy this story. David thought it would be just another ordinary day at the office, but within minutes his entire world was turned upside down. As an intern struggling to make a name for himself, all he ever wanted was to prove that he deserved a chance to rise above the poverty he had known his whole life. But what he found hidden deep within the company's financial records was more than a mistake. It was a discovery that could destroy everything. With his hands trembling and heart pounding, he faced a decision that no one his age should ever have to make. Exposing the truth could mean losing everything, including the one thing he fought hardest to protect: his family. The stakes couldn't be higher, and as he enters the boardroom, the weight of the secret he carries is about to crush him. What he never expected was how this revelation would turn the entire room into chaos and leave every single person in shock. What would you do if the truth could save your family but ruin your future? In a split second, David's life is about to change forever, and the only thing left is for you to witness the fallout. The fluorescent lights of Apex Corporation's Manhattan office buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across David Martinez's face as he stood frozen outside the imposing mahogany doors of the boardroom. His trembling hands clutched a worn manila envelope, its contents about to shatter the pristine facade of one of Wall Street's most respected firms. At just 22, David was the youngest intern Apex had ever hired. His threadbare suit and scuffed shoes stood in stark contrast to the sleek Armani-clad executives striding past. But appearances were deceiving. Behind David's weary eyes lay a fierce determination born from years of struggle. As he reached into his pocket, his fingers brushed against a crumpled photograph, the only one he had left of his mother. Her once radiant smile now seemed to mock him from the confines of the New York City homeless shelter where she'd spent the last 3 years. David's throat tightened as he remembered the promise he'd made to her on his last visit. "I'll get us out of this, Mom. I swear." This internship was supposed to be their ticket to a better life. Instead, it had become a moral minefield that threatened to destroy everything. Taking a deep breath, David pushed open the heavy doors. The sudden hush that fell over the room was deafening. A dozen pairs of eyes locked onto him, some curious, others annoyed at the interruption. But it was the cold, calculating stare of CFO Richard Blackwell that sent a chill down David's spine. Blackwell's lips curled into a smug smile as he addressed the room. Our little number cruncher decides to grace us with his presence. Tell me, David, have you finally managed to balance those pesky spreadsheets I assigned you?" A few chuckles rippled through the assembly, but David didn't flinch. "Actually, sir," he said, his voice steadier than he felt, "I found something you need to see." The laughter died as David approached the gleaming conference table. With shaking hands, he spread out the contents of his envelope: printouts, financial reports, and one damning spreadsheet that would change everything. "There's been a mistake in the quarterly reports," David explained, his heart pounding. "A discrepancy of $50 million. The room erupted in disbelief. Board members leaned forward, squinting at the numbers as if they might rearrange themselves into something less catastrophic. But it was Blackwell's reaction that confirmed David's worst fears. For just a fraction of a second, a flicker of panic crossed the CFO's face before his mask of cool indifference slammed back into place. "Nonsense," Blackwell scoffed, but there was an edge to his voice that hadn't been there before. "Our reports are vetted by the top accounting firms in the country. You must have made a mistake in your calculations." David stood his ground. "I've triple-checked everything, sir. The discrepancy is real, and it appears to have been deliberately concealed." A horrified gasp echoed through the room. The CEO, a silver-haired man named Jonathan Pierce, leaned forward with a grave expression. "That's a very serious accusation, young man. Do you have proof?" David nodded, his mouth dry. "Yes, sir. I've compiled a detailed report showing how the numbers were manipulated over the past year to hide the shortfall. It's fraud, sir." The word hung in the air like a bomb waiting to detonate. Board members exchanged panicked glances while others furiously tapped at their phones. But David's eyes remained locked on Blackwell, whose facade had finally cracked. The CFO's face was a mask of barely contained rage. As the room descended into chaos, David felt a strange sense of calm wash over him. He'd done it. He'd exposed the truth. But at what cost? His thoughts drifted to his mother, to the nights they'd spent huddled in their old Chevy, to the day he'd had to leave her at the shelter door. He'd promised her he'd find a way out, that he'd build them a better life. Now, with a single act of honesty, he might have destroyed their only chance. The CEO's voice cut through the din. "David, I need you to gather every shred of evidence you have. We'll need to launch a full investigation immediately." He turned to Blackwell, his expression thunderous. "Richard, I expect a full explanation for this. Now." Blackwell's eyes darted around the room like a cornered animal. Then, in a move that sent shockwaves through the assembly, he bolted for the door. "Stop him!" someone shouted, but it was too late. The CFO had vanished, leaving behind a stunned silence and the weight of his guilt. As security was called and the board members huddled in frantic discussion, David stood alone amidst the chaos. He'd exposed a truth that would rock Wall Street to its core, but the victory felt hollow. His future, so carefully planned, now lay in ruins. A gentle hand on his shoulder made him jump. It was Emily Chen, a fellow intern who'd always been kind to him. Her eyes were filled with a mix of awe and concern. "David," she whispered, "what you did was incredibly brave. But what happens now?" Before he could answer, David's phone buzzed. His heart sank as he saw the shelter's number flash across the screen. Whatever came next, he knew his life would never be the same. Just then, the CEO's voice cut through the noise. "David, I need to see you in my office, immediately." As he followed Pierce out of the boardroom, David couldn't shake the feeling that he was walking towards his own execution. He'd exposed the truth, yes, but at what cost? The weight of his decision pressed down on him with each step. The hallway seemed to stretch endlessly before him, a gauntlet of whispers and stares from shell-shocked employees who'd caught wind of the drama unfolding. David's mind raced. Would he be hailed as a hero or branded a traitor? Would this act of integrity save his career or destroy it before it had even begun? And what of his mother? The thought of her alone and vulnerable in that cold shelter made his chest tighten. He'd promised to save her, to give her the life she deserved. Now, that promise hung by a thread. As they reached the imposing oak door of the CEO's office, Pierce turned to David with an unreadable expression. "You've opened Pandora's box, son," he said quietly. "I hope you're prepared for what comes next." The door swung open, revealing a room that would determine the fate of not just David but countless others caught in the web of lies he'd uncovered. With a deep breath, he stepped inside, knowing that whatever happened next would change his life forever. The heavy oak door closed behind David with an ominous click. CEO Jonathan Pierce's corner office, with its panoramic view of the Manhattan skyline, suddenly felt claustrophobic. David's heart raced as he stood before the imposing mahogany desk, acutely aware of the contrast between his worn shoes and the plush carpet beneath them. Pierce settled into his leather chair, his steely gaze fixed on David. The silence stretched, thick with tension, until the CEO finally spoke. "Sit down, son. We need to talk." David lowered himself into the chair, his legs trembling. He braced himself for anger, for accusations, for the end of his fledgling career. Instead, Pierce's next words caught him completely off guard. "What you did in there, David, it took guts, real guts." The older man's tone was a mix of admiration and weariness. "But you've also opened up a can of worms that could destroy this company." Before David could respond, a sharp knock at the door interrupted them. Richard Blackwell, the CFO, strode in, his earlier panic now replaced by a calculated calm. David's stomach churned at the sight of him. "Ah, Richard," Pierce said, his voice suddenly cold. "I was just about to call security. Care to explain yourself?" Blackwell's lips curved into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "A simple misunderstanding, Jonathan. One I'm sure we can clear up quickly." His gaze shifted to David, and the young intern felt a chill run down his spine. "In private, preferably." Pierce's eyebrows shot up. "After that stunt you pulled, not a chance. Whatever you have to say, you can say it in front of David." Blackwell's smile tightened, but he nodded. "Very well." He turned to David, his voice taking on an almost fatherly tone. David, my boy, you've stumbled upon something very complex, something that goes far beyond a simple accounting error. David's mouth went dry. What do you mean? Blackwell sighed, a practiced sound of regret. The discrepancy you found, it's part of a much larger operation, one that's been keeping this company afloat for years. Without it, Apex would have gone under long ago, taking thousands of jobs with it. The room seemed to spin. David looked to Pierce for confirmation, but the CEO's face was unreadable. What you're suggesting is illegal, David said, his voice barely above a whisper. Blackwell nodded gravely. In the strictest sense, yes. But the world of high finance isn't always black and white, David. Sometimes to do good, we must operate in shades of gray. David's mind raced. He thought of his mother, of the promises he'd made, of the life he'd dreamed of giving her. As if reading his thoughts, Blackwell leaned forward. I understand you're in a difficult situation, David. Your mother, the shelter. He paused, letting the words hang in the air. What if I told you we could make all that go away? David's heart skipped a beat. What are you saying? Blackwell's voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper. Your silence, David. That's all we need. In return, we can offer you a sum that would change your life. Your mother's life. No more shelters. No more struggles. A fresh start. The offer hit David like a physical blow. He thought of his mother's tired eyes, of the nights spent in their old car, of the shame that had haunted them for years. With that kind of money, he could give her everything she deserved. Everything he'd promised. But the cost? I can't, David stammered, even as a part of him screamed to accept. It's wrong. People would get hurt. Blackwell's eyes hardened. People are already hurting, David. Think of the thousands who would lose their jobs if Apex goes under. Think of your mother still in that shelter. Are you really willing to sacrifice all of them for some abstract notion of right and wrong? David felt the weight of the decision crushing him. He looked to Pierce, hoping for guidance, but the CEO remained silent, his expression unreadable. I need time to think, David said, his voice cracking. Blackwell nodded, his smile returning. Of course, take the night to consider it, but remember, David, opportunities like this don't come along often, especially for people like, well, people in your situation. The word stung, reminding David of just how precarious his position was. As he stood to leave, his legs felt like lead. Oh, and David, Blackwell called after him, I'd keep this conversation to myself if I were you, for everyone's sake. The threat was clear. As David stumbled out of the office, his mind in turmoil, he nearly collided with Emily. Her concerned face swam into focus. David, are you okay? You look like you've seen a ghost. He opened his mouth to confide in her, but Blackwell's warning echoed in his ears. Instead, he mumbled an excuse and hurried past, leaving her staring after him in confusion. That night, in his tiny studio apartment, David sat on the edge of his bed, the crumpled photo of his mother in his hands. The sound of sirens and angry horns drifted up from the street below, a cacophony that matched the chaos in his mind. He thought of the life he could give his mother with Blackwell's offer. No more shelters, no more shame. But at what cost? Could he live with himself knowing he'd compromised everything he believed in? As dawn broke over the city, David made his decision. With shaking hands, he reached for his phone. Whatever choice he made, he knew there would be no going back. The line rang once, twice, then a familiar voice answered. Mr. Blackwell, it's David. I've made my decision. The New York summer sun beat down mercilessly as David made his way through the bustling streets of Manhattan. His crisp new suit, bought with a portion of Blackwell's advance, felt like armor against the world. But inside, he was crumbling. 2 weeks had passed since he'd made his fateful decision in that pre-dawn phone call. 2 weeks of sleepless nights, of avoiding eye contact with colleagues, of crafting elaborate lies to cover up the truth. The weight of his choice pressed down on him with every step. As he approached the towering glass edifice of Apex Corporation, David's eyes were drawn to a small figure huddled in the shadow of a nearby alley. His heart clenched as he recognized the familiar posture of someone who had nowhere else to go. It was a stark reminder of where he'd come from, and what he'd sacrificed to escape it. Inside the lobby, David The usual cacophony of ringing phones and clicking heels was muted, replaced by hushed whispers and furtive glances. News of the accounting discrepancy had spread like wildfire, despite the company's best efforts to contain it. David felt eyes on him as he made his way to the elevator, a mix of curiosity and suspicion that made his skin crawl. The doors opened on the executive floor, and David stepped out into a world that still felt alien to him. Plush carpets muffled his footsteps as he navigated the maze of corner offices and conference rooms. He paused outside Blackwell's door, steeling himself for what lay ahead. "Ah, David, right on time." Blackwell's voice was jovial, but there was a hardness in his eyes that sent a chill down David's spine. Come in. We have much to discuss." As the door closed behind him, David felt like a fly trapped in a spider's web. Blackwell gestured to a chair, his smile never reaching his eyes. "I trust you're settling into your new position?" The CFO's tone made it clear this was more than a casual inquiry. David nodded stiffly. "Yes, sir, thank you for the opportunity." Blackwell waved a hand dismissively. "Think nothing of it. You're a bright young man, David. It would be a shame to see that potential go to waste over a simple misunderstanding." The euphemism hung in the air between them, a reminder of the Faustian bargain David had struck. He thought of the apartment he'd rented for his mother, of the tears in her eyes when he'd moved her out of the shelter. Was it worth it? The question gnawed at him day and night. "Now," Blackwell continued, his tone shifting to business, "we need to discuss the upcoming audit. I trust you've made the necessary adjustments to the books?" David's mouth went dry. I've done what you asked, sir, but..." Blackwell's eyebrow arched dangerously. "But I'm worried," David admitted, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. "What if someone else notices? What if..." Blackwell's laugh cut him off. "My dear boy, you worry too much. This is how business is done at this level. The sooner you accept that, the easier your life will be." As if on cue, a knock at the door interrupted them. Emily Chen, David's fellow intern-turned-colleague, poked her head in. "Mr. Blackwell? The auditors are here. They're asking to see the Q3 reports." David felt the blood drain from his face. Those were the very reports he'd spent the last week adjusting at Blackwell's behest. "Excellent," Blackwell replied smoothly. "David here will escort them to the conference room and provide whatever assistance they need. Won't you, David?" It wasn't a question. David nodded numbly, rising to his feet. As he followed Emily out, he caught a glimpse of his reflection in the glass-paneled wall. He barely recognized the man staring back at him. In the elevator, Emily turned to him, her brow furrowed with concern. "David, are you okay? You've been so distant lately. Is everything all right?" For a moment, David was tempted to confess everything, to unburden himself of the crushing weight of his secrets. But the memory of his mother's smile, of her tearful gratitude when he'd rescued her from the shelter, held him back. "I'm fine," he lied, forcing a smile that felt more like a grimace. "Just stressed about the audit, you know." Emily nodded sympathetically, but her eyes remained troubled. As they exited the elevator, David couldn't shake the feeling that she saw right through him. The next few hours were a blur of spreadsheets and probing questions. David felt like he was walking a tightrope, every answer a potential misstep that could send him plummeting into the abyss. By the time the auditors left, promising to return the next day, he was drenched in sweat. As he gathered his things to leave, his phone buzzed with a text. His heart sank as he read the message from his mother. "Surprise, I made your favorite dinner, can't wait to see you, so proud of my boy." The words were like daggers to his heart. He thought of the lies he'd told her about his sudden promotion, about the source of their newfound wealth. How long could he keep up this charade? Lost in thought, David didn't notice Emily approach until she spoke. "David, I found something in the Q2 reports, something that doesn't add up." Her voice was low, urgent. "I think we need to talk." David felt the ground shift beneath his feet. As he met Emily's worried gaze, he realized that his carefully constructed house of cards was about to come crashing down. The elevator doors closed, trapping them together in the small space. David's mind raced, searching for a way out, a plausible explanation, anything to keep his fragile new world from shattering. But as Emily began to speak, laying out her suspicions in meticulous detail, David knew that his time was running out. The consequences of his choices were finally catching up to him, and the price would be steeper than he ever imagined. The fluorescent lights of the Apex Corporation parking garage cast harsh shadows as David's trembling hands fumbled with his car keys. Emily's words from their elevator confrontation echoed in his mind, each syllable a hammer blow to his crumbling resolve. "David, I know something's not right," she had said, her eyes searching his face. "The numbers in those reports, they don't match up. And you've been acting so strange lately. Please, just tell me what's going on. Maybe I can help." He had managed to deflect her concerns with vague excuses about stress and overwork, but David knew it was only a temporary reprieve. Emily was too smart, too observant. It was only a matter of time before she pieced together the truth. As he slid into the driver's seat of his newly leased BMW, another gift from Blackwell, David's phone buzzed. His stomach churned as he saw the CFO's name on the screen. "My office, 7 a.m. sharp. We need to discuss our intern problem." The drive home was a blur of neon signs and honking horns, the chaos of New York City at night matching the turmoil in David's mind. He barely registered the transition from the gritty streets of Manhattan to the tree-lined avenues of his new neighborhood in Queens. As he pulled into the driveway of the modest but well-maintained house he now shared with his mother, David took a deep breath, steeling himself for the performance ahead. He pasted on a smile and stepped inside. "David, there you are." His mother's voice, warm and full of love, hit him like a physical blow. She emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on an apron. "I was starting to worry. Your favorite lasagna is getting cold." The aroma of tomato sauce and melted cheese filled the air, a bittersweet reminder of simpler times. David forced his smile wider, ignoring the guilt gnawing at his insides. "Sorry, Mom, got caught up at work. You know how it is with this new position." His mother beamed with pride. "Of course, sweetheart. I still can't believe how quickly you've moved up in that company. They must really see your potential." If only she knew the truth. David felt the weight of his lies pressing down on him as they sat down to eat. He picked at his food, his mother's cheerful chatter about her new volunteer work at the local community center washing over him. "And Mrs. Goldstein from next door was asking about you again," his mother was saying. "Such a nice lady. You know, her granddaughter is about your age. Maybe you two could—" "Mom, please," David cut her off more sharply than he intended. I'm not really in the dating mindset right now. Work is just so busy, and—" He trailed off, catching sight of the hurt look that flashed across his mother's face. Another lie. Another disappointment. How many more could he pile on before it all came crashing down? "I'm sorry," he said softly. "It's just been a long day. I think I'm going to turn in early." His mother nodded, her smile tinged with concern. "Of course, honey, get some rest. You're working too hard." In the sanctuary of his room, David collapsed onto his bed, the events of the day pressing down on him like a physical weight. He stared at the ceiling, mind racing. How had he gotten here? How had one decision, one moment of weakness, spiraled so far out of control? His phone buzzed again, another text from Blackwell. "Hope you're prepared for tomorrow. Remember, we're all counting on you." The threat beneath the seemingly innocuous words was clear. David's hands shook as he typed out a reply. "I'll be there." Sleep eluded him that night. David tossed and turned, haunted by visions of Emily's suspicious gaze, of Blackwell's predatory smile, of his mother's trusting eyes. By the time his alarm blared at 6 a.m., he felt like he'd been hit by a truck. The early morning streets of New York were quieter than usual as David made his way to the office. The calm before the storm, he thought grimly. Blackwell was waiting for him, a shark-like grin on his face. "Ah, David, right on time. Come in, come in." As the door closed behind him, David felt like he was sealing his own fate. Blackwell's office seemed smaller somehow, the walls closing in. "So," Blackwell began, his tone deceptively casual. "It seems our little Miss Chen has been asking some inconvenient questions." David's heart raced. "Sir, Blackwell held up a hand, silencing him. "No need to explain, David. I understand. You're young, idealistic. You want to do the right thing." His eyes hardened. But let me be clear. There is no right thing here. There's only survival. He slid a folder across the desk. David's hands trembled as he opened it, revealing documents he'd never seen before. "What is this?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Blackwell's smile was cold. "Insurance, my boy. A paper trail that links you, and only you, to our little accounting discrepancy. If this were to find its way to the authorities..." He let the implication hang in the air. David felt the blood drain from his face. You're framing me. I prefer to think of it as motivation," Blackwell replied smoothly, "to ensure your continued cooperation. Now, about Miss Chen." As Blackwell laid out his plan, a web of lies and misdirection designed to throw Emily off the scent, David felt something inside him break. This was no longer about protecting his mother or securing their future. This was about survival in a game where the rules were rigged from the start. By the time he left Blackwell's office, the sun was fully up, bathing the city in a golden light that seemed to mock David's inner darkness. As he made his way to his desk, he caught sight of Emily across the office floor. She smiled and waved, oblivious to the betrayal he was about to commit. David's hand hovered over his keyboard, Blackwell's instructions echoing in his mind. One email, carefully crafted, would be enough to discredit Emily's concerns and protect the lie he was now irrevocably part of. But as he began to type, a new thought emerged, small but persistent. What if there was another way out? The New York City summer heat seemed to intensify as David's moral dilemma reached its boiling point. The Apex Corporation's air-conditioned offices did little to cool the feverish thoughts racing through his mind. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, poised to send the email that would discredit Emily and cement his role in Blackwell's scheme. But he couldn't do it. With a sudden, decisive movement, David pushed away from his desk. He needed air, needed to think. As he hurried towards the elevator, he caught Emily's concerned gaze from across the room. The guilt threatened to overwhelm him. The rooftop garden of Apex Tower was supposed to be a sanctuary for stressed employees, but today it felt like a prison yard to David. He paced between the carefully manicured flower beds, the Manhattan skyline a stark backdrop to his internal turmoil. "David?" He spun around to find Emily standing there, worry etched across her face. "Are you okay? You've been acting strange all week, and now..." David's resolve crumbled. "Emily, I need to tell you something, but not here." They found a quiet corner cafe a few blocks from the office. As they settled into a secluded booth, David's hands shook as he clutched his coffee mug. "What I'm about to tell you, it could ruin everything. My career, my life, my mother's future. But I can't keep lying. I can't be part of this anymore." Emily reached across the table, her hand warm on his. "David, whatever it is, we can figure it out together. Just tell me." And so, in hushed tones punctuated by the clatter of dishes and the hum of conversation around them, David confessed everything. The initial discovery of the accounting error, Blackwell's manipulation, the bribe, the cover-up. It all came pouring out in a torrent of guilt and relief. Emily listened in stunned silence, her expression shifting from shock to anger to compassion. When David finally fell silent, emotionally spent, she squeezed his hand. "Oh, David," she said softly. "I'm so sorry you've been carrying this alone, but we need to report this. You know that, right?" David nodded, a weight lifting from his shoulders even as a new fear settled in his stomach. "I know, but Blackwell, he has documents. He set me up to take the fall if this comes out." Emily's eyes hardened with determination. "Then we'll need proof. Hard evidence that shows Blackwell's involvement. Do you think you can get it?" The plan they hatched over the next hour was risky, bordering on insane. But as David made his way back to the office, he felt a glimmer of hope for the first time in weeks. That hope was quickly extinguished when he found Blackwell waiting at his desk, a predatory smile on his face. "David, my boy, I trust you've taken care of our little problem?" David's mouth went dry. I'm working on it, sir. These things take time to make sure they're done right." Blackwell's smile didn't waver, but his eyes turned to ice. "Indeed they do. Which is why I've decided to accelerate our timeline. The board is meeting tomorrow to discuss the company's financial future. I expect you to be there, ready to present a very specific set of numbers. Understand? As Blackwell walked away, David felt the walls closing in. He had less than 24 hours to gather the evidence he needed and expose the truth, or become an unwitting accomplice to an even bigger fraud. The next morning dawned gray and ominous, matching David's mood as he made his way to Apex Tower. The weight of the USB drive in his pocket felt like a ticking bomb. Emily was waiting for him in the lobby, her face a mask of calm determination. "Ready?" she asked quietly. David nodded, his heart pounding. "As I'll ever be." The elevator ride to the executive floor seemed to take an eternity. As they stepped out, David caught sight of his reflection in the polished doors. He barely recognized the man staring back at him. The boardroom was already full when they arrived, a sea of expensive suits and carefully neutral expressions. Blackwell sat at the head of the table, his confident smirk faltering slightly at the sight of Emily. "Mr. Martinez," the CEO intoned, "I believe you have a presentation for us?" David took a deep breath, steeling himself for what was to come. "Yes, sir, but not the one you're expecting." The room fell silent as David connected his USB drive to the large display screen. As the first incriminating document appeared, a gasp rippled through the assembled executives. "What is the meaning of this?" Blackwell sputtered, his face turning an alarming shade of red. "The truth, Mr. Blackwell," David replied, his voice steadier than he felt. "The complete truth about the fraudulent activities you've been orchestrating at Apex Corporation. What followed was a whirlwind of accusations, denials, and shocking revelations." David and Emily presented their evidence methodically, laying bare the extent of Blackwell's deception. But it was the final piece of evidence that left everyone in the room stunned into silence. "And now," David said, his heart racing, "there's one more thing you need to see." He pulled up a scanned document, its yellowed edges a stark contrast to the crisp financial reports they'd been examining. It was an employee file from nearly 3 decades ago. "This," David explained, his voice thick with emotion, "is my mother's personnel file from Apex Corporation. She worked here as an accountant in the early 90s, and she was fired, by you, Mr. Blackwell, when she threatened to expose similar fraudulent activities back then." The revelation hit the room like a thunderbolt. Blackwell's face drained of color as he realized the full extent of his downfall. You're Maria's son?" he whispered, recognition and fear dawning in his eyes. David nodded, tears threatening to spill over. "The woman you drove into poverty and homelessness. The woman I've been trying to save ever since." The silence that followed was deafening. Then slowly the CEO rose to his feet. "Mr. Blackwell, you are suspended effective immediately pending a full investigation. Mr. Martinez, Ms. Chen, thank you for your courage in bringing this to light. We have a lot of work ahead of us to set things right." As security escorted a shell-shocked Blackwell from the room, David felt a strange mix of relief and trepidation wash over him. He'd exposed the truth, but at what cost? What would happen to his mother now? To his own future? Emily's hand found his under the table, a silent gesture of support. Whatever came next, he realized he wouldn't have to face it alone. As they left the boardroom, David's phone buzzed with a text. It was from his mother. "Saw the news about Apex. Are you okay? Call me when you can. I love you, no matter what." David's vision blurred with tears as he read the message. The road ahead would be difficult, but for the first time in months, he felt like he could breathe again. The truth, painful as it was, had finally set him free. The days following the explosive board meeting passed in a blur for David. The once bustling offices of Apex Corporation had become a hive of frantic activity, with teams of lawyers, auditors, and investigators swarming every floor. The company's stock price had plummeted, and the media circus camped outside the building's gleaming facade showed no signs of abating. David sat in a small conference room, his tie loosened and shirt sleeves rolled up, surrounded by stacks of financial documents. The soft glow of his laptop screen illuminated the dark circles under his eyes, evidence of sleepless nights spent helping to unravel years of financial deceit. A gentle knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. Emily entered, carrying 2 steaming cups of coffee. "Thought you could use this," she said, placing one in front of him. "How are you holding up?" David managed a weak smile. "As well as can be expected, I guess. You?" Emily sighed, sinking into the chair beside him. "It's been..." Intense, but at least we're doing the right thing now. The weight of their shared ordeal hung between them. Over the past week, they had been questioned repeatedly by internal investigators, federal agents, and the SEC. Their lives had been turned inside out, every decision scrutinized, every relationship examined for potential conflicts of interest. "Have you spoken to your mother?" Emily asked softly. David's expression tightened. "Briefly, she's processing everything. I think she's proud of what I did, but also scared about what it means for our future." Before Emily could respond, David's phone buzzed. His heart sank as he saw the name on the screen. Jonathan Pierce, Apex's CEO. "Martinez, my office now." The walk to the executive floor felt like a march to the gallows. Despite his role in exposing the fraud, David couldn't shake the fear that he too would be swept up in the fallout. As he entered Pierce's office, he was surprised to find not just the CEO, but also several members of the board. "David, please sit down," Pierce said, his tone unreadable. "We've been discussing your situation at length." David's mouth went dry as he lowered himself into the chair. This was it, the moment his life would change forever, for better or worse. Pierce leaned forward, his hands clasped on the desk. "What you and Ms. Chen did was incredibly brave. You've saved this company from an even greater disaster, and for that, we're grateful." David nodded, waiting for the other shoe to drop. "However," Pierce continued, "the fact remains that you were, for a time, complicit in Mr. Blackwell's schemes. We understand the circumstances, but it complicates matters." One of the board members, an older woman with steel-gray hair, spoke up. "We've decided that the best course of action is for you to take a leave of absence while the investigation concludes. Your cooperation has been noted and will be taken into account." David felt a mix of relief and apprehension wash over him. It wasn't ideal, but it was far better than he had feared. "There's one more thing," Pierce added, his expression softening slightly. "In light of what we've learned about your mother's history with the company, we'd like to offer her a settlement. It won't undo the past, but we hope it might provide some measure of justice." As David left the office, his mind reeling from the meeting, he found Emily waiting anxiously in the hallway. "Well?" she asked, her eyes searching his face. David gave her a tired smile. "I'm on leave, but I think it's going to be okay." Eventually, they made their way to the elevator in silence, both lost in thought about the uncertain future ahead. As the doors closed, Emily suddenly turned to him. "David, I need to tell you something." Her voice was hesitant, almost afraid. "I've been offered a position with the SEC to help with cases like this, to prevent them from happening again." David felt a pang of something. Pride, jealousy, loss? He wasn't sure. "Emily, that's amazing. You'll be incredible at that." She nodded, not quite meeting his eyes. "It means I'll be leaving New York, and I won't be able to have contact with anyone involved in the Apex case for a while, including you." The implications of her words hung heavily between them. All the unspoken feelings, the connection forged through shared adversity. It would have to be put on hold, perhaps forever. As they reached the lobby, David turned to her. "Emily, She cut him off with a sad smile. "I know, me too. But right now we both have to focus on rebuilding our lives. Maybe someday." They embraced, a bittersweet goodbye filled with all the words they couldn't say. As Emily walked away, disappearing into the busy New York street, David felt a chapter of his life closing. That evening, as he sat in his mother's small kitchen, the weight of everything that had happened finally hit him. His mother listened patiently as he poured out his fears, his regrets, his hopes for redemption. When he finished, she took his hand in hers, her eyes shining with a mixture of tears and pride. "David, my brave boy, you did the right thing, even when it was the hardest thing. That's all a mother could ever ask for." As they sat there, the soft glow of the kitchen light a warm contrast to the chaos of the past weeks, David felt a glimmer of hope. The road ahead would be difficult, filled with legal battles and public scrutiny. But he had faced his demons, had chosen truth over comfort. Whatever came next, he would face it with a clear conscience and the knowledge that he had, in the end, made his mother proud. The Manhattan skyline glittered outside the window, a reminder of the world that lay beyond this moment of peace. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new decisions. But for now, in this quiet kitchen with the person he had fought so hard to protect, David allowed himself to breathe, to hope, and to believe that even in the darkest of times, redemption was possible. 6 months had passed since the Apex Corporation scandal had rocked Wall Street. The crisp autumn air carried a hint of winter as David Martinez made his way through Central Park, fallen leaves crunching beneath his feet. The world had moved on, new scandals and headlines pushing Apex from the forefront of public consciousness. But for David, the aftermath of his decision continued to shape every aspect of his life. He found a bench overlooking the lake, a favorite spot for quiet reflection. As he sat down, his phone buzzed with a news alert. Another former Apex executive had pleaded guilty, facing years in prison. David's testimony had been instrumental in securing the conviction, but the victory felt hollow. His mind drifted to the past months, the endless depositions, the media scrutiny, the whispered conversations that stopped when he entered a room. The settlement from Apex had provided financial stability for him and his mother, but the emotional toll had been steep. "David?" He looked up, startled to see a familiar face. It was Jonathan Pierce, the former CEO of Apex, looking far older and more worn than David remembered. "Mr. Pierce," David said, surprised. "I didn't expect to see you here." Pierce gave a weary smile. "I come here often these days, it's peaceful." He gestured to the empty space on the bench. "May I?" David nodded, a mix of emotions churning inside him. As Pierce sat down, the silence between them was heavy with unspoken words. "I've been following the trials," Pierce finally said. "Your testimony, it couldn't have been easy." David let out a bitter laugh. "None of this has been easy, Mr. Pierce." The older man nodded, his eyes fixed on the distant skyline. "I've had a lot of time to think about what happened at Apex, about the choices we all made." He turned to David, his expression pained. "I want you to know that I'm sorry. I should have seen what was happening, should have done more to stop it." The words hit David like a physical blow. He had spent months grappling with his own role in the scandal, but hearing Pierce's apology brought a fresh wave of doubt crashing over him. "Do you ever wonder," David asked quietly, "if we did the right thing, exposing it all?" Pierce was silent for a long moment. "Every day," he finally admitted. "I think about the jobs lost, the lives upended, but then I remember the greater damage that would have been done if it had continued." He looked at David intently. "You did the right thing, son. Never doubt that." As Pierce stood to leave, he placed a hand on David's shoulder. "You're young, David. You have a chance to rebuild, to do something good with what you've learned. Don't let this define you." David watched as the former CEO walked away, his words echoing in the crisp air. He pulled out his phone, staring at the last text he had received from Emily months ago. "Thinking of you. Stay strong." With trembling fingers, he began to type. "Emily, I hope this finds you well. I've been doing a lot of thinking." He paused, unsure how to continue. The cursor blinked accusingly, a reminder of all the words left unsaid between them. Just then his phone rang. It was his mother. "David, honey, I need you to come home. There's something we need to talk about." The urgency in her voice sent a chill down his spine. As he hurried out of the park hailing a taxi, David couldn't shake the feeling that another seismic shift was coming in his life. The ride to Queens seemed to take an eternity. His mind raced with possibilities, each scenario worse than the last. Had the settlement money run out? Was his mother sick? Had new evidence been uncovered in the Apex case? When he finally burst through the door of their small house, he found his mother sitting at the kitchen table, a stack of papers in front of her and tears in her eyes. "Mom, what's wrong? What happened?" She looked up at him, her expression a mix of fear and determination that he had never seen before. "David, sit down. There's something I need to tell you about your father." The world seemed to tilt on its axis as David lowered himself into a chair. His father had never been part of his life, a topic his mother had always avoided discussing. "What about him?" David asked, his voice barely above a whisper. His mother took a deep breath, pushing the papers towards him. He worked at Apex too, with Richard Blackwell." David's blood ran cold as he looked at the documents. Old employee records, news clippings, and a faded photograph of a man who looked eerily like himself, standing next to a younger Blackwell. "I don't understand," David said, his mind reeling. "Why are you telling me this now?" His mother's voice shook as she replied, "Because he's been released from prison, David, and he's looking for you." As the implications of her words sank in, David felt the ground shift beneath him once again. Just when he thought he had begun to find his footing, to chart a path forward, the past had reached out to pull him back into its tangled web. The papers on the table seemed to mock him, each one a new revelation that threatened to unravel everything he thought he knew about himself and his family. As he met his mother's tear-filled gaze, David realized that the moment of doubt he had been grappling with in the park was nothing compared to the crisis of identity and purpose that now lay before him. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the kitchen, a fitting metaphor for the darkness that seemed to be encroaching on David's hard-won peace. As he began to sort through the documents, each new piece of information feeling like another blow, he couldn't help but wonder, had his quest for truth and justice only scratched the surface of a much deeper, more personal mystery? With trembling hands, he picked up the photograph of his father, studying the face that was both familiar and utterly foreign. Whatever came next, David knew that the choices he made in the coming days would define not just his future, but his very understanding of who he was and where he came from. The sound of his phone buzzing broke the tense silence. A new message from Emily flashed on the screen. "David, we need to talk. There's been a development in the case. Call me as soon as you can." As he stared at the message, then back at the documents scattered across the table, David felt the weight of his past and the uncertainty of his future converging in a moment of paralyzing indecision. The truth had set him free once before, but now he wondered, at what cost would this new truth come? The New York City skyline glittered in the distance as David stood on the roof of his apartment building, the cool night air a stark contrast to the turmoil raging inside him. In his hand, he clutched the worn photograph of his father, a man he'd never known, yet whose shadow had suddenly engulfed his life. His phone buzzed again, Emily's name flashing on the screen. He had been avoiding her calls since that fateful day in his mother's kitchen, unsure of how to navigate this new maze of truths and lies. With a deep breath, he answered, "Emily?" "David, thank God." Her voice was a mix of relief and urgency. "I've been trying to reach you for days. There's been a major development in the Apex case." David's grip tightened on the phone. "What kind of development?" "New evidence has surfaced pointing to a much larger conspiracy. And David, your father's name is all over it." The world seemed to tilt beneath his feet. "What are you saying, Emily?" "I'm saying that this goes deeper than we ever imagined. Your father wasn't just an employee at Apex. He was Blackwell's partner in a scheme that spans decades. And now that he's out..." David cut her off, his mind racing. "He's trying to tie up loose ends." "Exactly," Emily confirmed. "David, you're in danger. We all are. I'm flying back to New York tonight. We need to meet." As the call ended, David stared out at the city, feeling more lost than ever. The truth he'd fought so hard to expose had only been the tip of an iceberg, one that threatened to sink everything he held dear. Descending back to his apartment, David found his mother waiting, her eyes red from crying. "I heard your conversation," she said softly. "I'm so sorry, David. I never wanted you to be caught up in all of this." David sat beside her, taking her hand. "Mom, I need you to tell me everything, no more secrets." And so, as the night deepened, his mother unraveled a tale that left David reeling. His father, Michael Martinez, had been Blackwell's right-hand man in a complex web of financial fraud that extended far beyond Apex. When the scheme threatened to unravel years ago, Michael had taken the fall, protecting Blackwell and the others involved. "He went to prison believing they would take care of us," his mother explained, her voice barely above a whisper. "But Blackwell betrayed him, left us with nothing. That's how we ended up on the streets." David's mind was a whirlwind of emotions, anger, betrayal, and a desperate need for answers. And now he's out looking for revenge? His mother nodded, fear evident in her eyes. "Or looking to restart the old operation. Either way, it puts you in the crosshairs." As dawn broke over the city, David made a decision. He couldn't run from this, couldn't hide from the truth any longer. It was time to confront his past head-on. He arranged to meet Emily at a quiet cafe near Central Park, his nerves on edge as he scanned every face for potential threats. When she arrived, the relief on her face was palpable. "David," she said, embracing him tightly. "I was so worried." As they sat, David noticed the dark circles under her eyes, the tension in her shoulders. This case had taken its toll on her too. "Tell me everything," he said. Emily laid out the details of the new investigation, revealing a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of finance and government. David's father was a key player, his release from prison setting off a chain reaction that threatened to expose it all. "We have a chance to bring down the entire network," Emily explained, her eyes alight with determination. "But we need your help, David. Your insight, your connections, they could be crucial." David felt the weight of her words, of the choice before him. He could walk away, try to protect himself and his mother from the storm that was coming. Or he could dive back in, risking everything to expose the full truth. As he wrestled with the decision, his phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Son, we need to talk. Meet me where it all began, Dad." David's heart raced as he showed the message to Emily. She gripped his hand tightly. "David, this could be a trap. You can't go alone." He knew she was right, but something inside him needed this confrontation, needed answers. "I have to do this, Emily, but I won't go in blind." Together, they formulated a plan. Emily would alert her contacts at the SEC, setting up surveillance. David would meet his father, wearing a wire to capture any incriminating information. As the sun began to set, David found himself standing outside the old Apex Corporation building, now a hollow shell of its former glory. His father's message had been clear. This was where their twisted family legacy had begun. With a deep breath, he stepped inside the abandoned lobby, the echoes of his footsteps a haunting reminder of all that had been lost. And there, standing in the shadows, was a face he'd only known from photographs. Older, weathered, but unmistakably his father. "David," Michael Martinez said, his voice rough with emotion. "You look so much like your mother." David felt a surge of conflicting emotions, anger, curiosity, and a longing he'd never allowed himself to acknowledge. "Why now?" he demanded. "Why come back after all this time?" His father's expression darkened. "Because the game isn't over, son, and you've put yourself right in the middle of it." As they stood there, father and son reunited in the ruins of their shared past, David realized that every choice he'd made had led him to this moment. The truth he'd sought had always been a double-edged sword, cutting through lies but also slicing open old wounds. With the weight of his wire pressing against his chest, David took a step towards his father. Whatever came next, he knew that the real conspiracy was only beginning to unravel, and he was now at the very heart of it. "Tell me everything," David said, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "No more secrets, no more lies." As his father began to speak, David felt the final pieces of his old life falling away. The choice he'd made by coming here would reshape not just his future, but the future of everyone touched by this far-reaching web of deceit. The truth, he realized, was both a burden and a weapon, and he was now its reluctant wielder.
Thank you for listening until the end. Share your opinion about the story in the comments and let us know which character you liked the most. If this story touched you and you want to hear more, click on the next story appearing on your screen. Leave a like and subscribe to our channel so we can build a great community of people who share emotional stories together. Until the next story.